our second Cardinal Newman Lecture Series. And the series is named after Blessed John Henry Newman, the great 19th century English prelate who wrote movingly about his intellectual journey toward Roman Catholicism in his spiritual autobiography called, in the Latin, Apologia Pro Vita Sua. That was in 1864. Newman's work, his life really, modeled for later generations of Catholics and for converts to Catholicism, a mapping out of a way to understand the datum of contemporary religious faith in light of Catholic philosophy, theology, history, and literature. So honoring this engagement with the Catholic intellectual and artistic tradition, the Hank Center invites a scholar each year to recount the way their own discovery, or perhaps rediscovery, of the Catholic intellectual heritage has influenced their work or offered insights for further investigation. We're very pleased tonight to have with us Professor Gregory Wolfe of Seattle Pacific University. A writer, teacher, editor, and publisher, Mr. Wolfe has published over 200 essays, reviews, and articles in numerous journals such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Commonweal, and First Things, among others. Mr. Wolfe founded Image Magazine. You saw a couple of those Image magazines actually on the counter, and they were a part of this kind of series of photos. He founded this in 1989, and today it's considered one of the best of America's literary quarterlies. It's a really unique forum for the best writing and artwork that's informed by or grapples with religious faith and identity. It's one of the best, I think, exemplars, really, of what we might call today contemporary Christian humanism. I first came across Mr. Wolfe by reading those concise and insightful editorial prefaces at the beginning of the magazine. And as a matter of fact, I try to read at least a poem, a story, or an essay, but I never miss those 2-page introductions because they're quite filled with provocative things to think about. And you put them together as a book, I see, Intruding Upon the Timeless, Meditations on Art, Faith, and Mystery. Mr. Wolfe has authored other books as well, including a biography of Malcolm Muggeridge with Erdman's Press, a book on the art of William Schickel with Notre Dame Press, and is at work on a book entitled The Company of Good Letters, How Erasmus and His Circle of Renaissance Christian Humanists Shaped the Modern World. Mr. Wolfe himself is a convert to Roman Catholicism and is a member of the international lay movement Communion and Liberation. His talk today is entitled Shouts or Whispers, A Journey Through Catholic Letters Today. Please help me welcome to the podium Gregory Wolfe.
Apparently Father Bosco was not informed that today's lecture is being preempted by a world premiere screening of the film Noah. That took you a while. Kind of slow bunch, aren't you? Just kidding. Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you, Father Mark, for the invitation. It's obviously a huge honor and a slightly intimidating thing to be asked to speak under the heading of Cardinal Newman. But I always think of his motto that he chose for himself, the beautiful motto, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. And I suppose in some ways, I've been asked today to talk a little bit about my vocation, and I suppose in some ways that's a pretty good summary of where my vocation comes from or comes to. Actually, let me just set this up here. I put a very small explosive device in here that will go off if I speak too long. It won't harm any of you. It'll just knock me out slightly. You can wake me up and then ask questions. I think that Flannery O'Connor had it right when she said that today that reason and imagination have been separated from one another, and that is an impoverishment of our intellectual tradition, and particularly of the Catholic tradition. We hear all the time about faith and reason. Those are the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes of our tradition, and they deservedly are so. But I've long wanted to lobby to add the word imagination, so that's truly a Trinitarian formula of faith, reason, and imagination. And I think Flannery O'Connor would argue that the old idea of reason was a more ample and fuller word that might well have included that. And she would have probably had a few hundred quotes from St. Thomas Aquinas to back her up on that. So I can also tell you that as a convert to Catholicism, reading John Henry Newman's The Apologia Pro Vita Sua was pretty much the last straw for me. That and a couple of Vatican documents, and I marched up to Greyfriars and said, "Sign me up." Now, it's also a great honor and a pleasure to be here at a Jesuit institution, also very intimidating. I must say that I've been getting a lot of attention lately from the Dominicans, so it's nice to see a little notice from the Jesuit community. I'm really hoping at some point to get a bidding war started up. I thought I might try to tell you some Jesuit jokes, but I figure you've heard them all before. Well, there's this one, which is, a Jesuit, a Dominican, and a Franciscan walk into a bar, and the bartender says, "Is this some kind of joke?" Okay. Quit while you're behind. The Jesuit charism is really profoundly meaningful to me. I know this term Christian humanism sounds a little weird on the ear, particularly because we've lived for 30 or 40 years with the word humanism in our culture modified primarily by secular. That is, in fact, a historical anomaly and not, in fact, a rich heritage of the West. If you know anything about the founding of the Jesuit order, you know that it would be impossible to think of the Jesuit charism without the great efflorescence of Renaissance Christian humanism. Now, it's true that St. Ignatius had some issues with Erasmus. He was a little touchy about Erasmus, but that whole wonderful growth of the Renaissance Christian humanist interest in the importance of literature as a moderating force to give concreteness and credibility to the abstractions that we get from the powerful realms of philosophy and theology was very much at the heart of the Jesuit order's founding. In fact, one book that's been hugely influential for me is a book by a Jesuit named John W. O'Malley called Four Cultures of the West. It's a really wonderfully accessible book. He's a professor at another institution you might have heard of called Georgetown, and his book is called Four Cultures of the West. Really well written, written for just the basically college-educated audience. It tells of these four cultures that he says there are more, but these kind of core cultures, the prophetic religious culture, the academic skeptical culture, and he talks about how powerful those are, founding the kind of Judeo-Christian classical synthesis that is Western culture. He also talks about how demanding they are, how all-encompassing they are. Reason and revelation each come on strong and sometimes want to elbow the other aside. And then he says culture 3 is the culture of rhetoric and literature and of the imagination. And this third culture, the rhetoric culture of rhetoric, is a kind of mediating force. Rhetoric is about how to unite things that become separate and divided. And the word, again, is just like humanism has been more or less ruined for us because we think of rhetoric as just lies and manipulation. But in the ancient sense of rhetoric, it was this thing that tries to make connections between people who are potentially at odds or divided from one another. And then the fourth culture, he said, is the culture of the visual and the performing arts. And Father O'Malley wrote this book in many ways. He's very kind of coy about this, or just shy and reticent about it, but I think this book came out of his desire to understand his own Jesuit charism, because in many ways the Jesuits pursued in a very active way a beautiful and really admirable synthesis of these four cultures to kind of bring these sometimes warring kinds of ways of human endeavor into a kind of balance and dialogue with each other is really amazing. I don't know how many of you know, but the Jesuits, for example, were, speaking of that fourth culture, were absolutely central in kind of launching what you might call both modern opera and modern ballet from the very, very early decades of their culture. So it's wonderful to be here in such a context. Now, I'm speaking about my vocation, about sort of what's led me to write the way I have and to publish the kind of journal that I have. I've been thinking about this a little bit lately because it is officially the 25th anniversary of Image this year. Brings to mind the Grateful Dead's line, "What a long, strange trip it's been." So I've been thinking a lot about these issues, and I'm grateful to be asked to speak about them. My story is a story of a place where art, religion, and politics meet. My pilgrimage, my journey, has taken me from a very interesting part of the American subculture. I grew up in what you would call the conservative intellectual movement. I sort of had Bill Buckley's National Review magazine, tucked into my, bassinet when I was very young. Because my father was involved with this. This is the rise of modern conservative intellectual political thought in the post-war era. And I was a good son and followed in my father's footsteps and went to a college one state over that's well known for being a mecca for young conservatives. And so my education was kind of driven by those political concerns. At the same time, I always, in addition to the political and economic realm, I always loved the world of the arts and the literature. That's because my father, who was a writer and a crusader for causes, anti-communist causes, pro-free market causes, my mother was not so political. She was interested in the arts, particularly the visual arts and dance, and I was privileged enough to be able to grow up, at least for part of my youth, in Manhattan. So my mom's idea of kind of an outing would be to take me a few blocks over to the Guggenheim Museum, or maybe to the Whitney, certainly to the Metropolitan. Occasionally she'd let me go to the Museum of Natural History so I could look at the dinosaurs and the cheetahs and the baboons and so on, as a little bit of a concession. But I've realized more and more how this affected me, because in an era where a lot of us are pretty alienated from contemporary art, often for good reasons, because a lot of it seems to, I published an essay once in Image about a guy's visit to the Tate Modern in London, and the title of the essay was "Art That Hates You." And we've all suffered from art that seems to hate us, and so we're often alienated from it and feel more comfortable looking towards the classics of the past. But I've more and more realized that my constant immersion in contemporary art, going to places like the Guggenheim and the Whitney, probably cultivated in me just an extra openness to this, an extra curiosity about this that has kind of shaped the way that I've gone about doing things. And so when I got to college, I had politics and I had the literary imaginative arts side, and they were kind of warring together. And I was told about a writer named T.S. Eliot, and immediately I was interested because I was told that Eliot was a traditional Christian who knew how to bash those secular Bloomsbury intellectuals, and that when Eliot would publish an essay upholding the great Anglican tradition, Virginia Woolf would have go to bed and have a migraine for 5 days. And I thought, yes, that's right. And then I came across a famous manifesto that Eliot uttered at one point. I think he came later to regret it for its very reductive and simplistic kind of approach. But at one point, when he was at his most feisty, kind of fighting with these secular intellectuals of his era, he said, in aesthetics, I am a classicist. You have to realize that may seem like, who cares? Blah. But in those days, Romanticism was still worshipped and super powerful, and to be a kind of classicist, stiff upper spine kind of thing, was really to be as corny and sort of reactionary as possible. And he said, in religion, I am Anglo-Catholic. And of course, that also felt like very pretentious, high church, smells and bells, as they would call it in the Anglican tradition. But then came the kicker where he said, and in politics, I am a monarchist. Now, as a young American conservative weenie, you can't get any more conservative than saying monarchy, yes! Right? Okay, forget democracy. Okay, never mind. Never mind. You guys had coffee yet or something? No, just kidding. So Eliot was a hero, and I admired his mind. I admired started a journal called The Criterion, and that got me curious about what it might be like to be a publisher and editor of a literary intellectual journal. And eventually I ended up having to read his poetry because generally speaking, he's kind of known as a poet. He's sort of published poetry, and that's sort of why people thought he was a big deal. So, and this is the world that I grew up in, where very much have a hostile attitude towards the world of the present, and in particularly what people would call modernity. When they said modernity, or even better, when they said modern art, you would always imagine them saying those words as if they had capital letters, because they would say, modern art, which was everything bad. It was, with all these artists doing abstraction, and these writers writing in fragments with all these difficult, heavy allusions that you have to track down. Of course, they put given English professors cushy jobs ever since. But, and I read Eliot, and I sort of had this little cognitive dissonance thing where I was going along, reading The Wasteland. Oh yeah, Wasteland, the modern world's a wasteland, right, yes. Until at one point it kind of went, wait a minute, this guy is working in modern art. Oh no. Because Eliot's poetry was quintessentially high modernism. It was full of fragments, full of difficult allusions. So I had a kind of crisis of faith, because my conservative brethren were like, modernity is bad, modern art is bad. And in some ways they had, what I've now come to realize, to quote that early church heresy, a kind of Gnostic attitude. That's spelled with a G, so Gnostic, anyway. The early church heresy called Gnosticism was about the idea that this world that we lived in was like totally evil. It was created by like some sub-god, and matter, ooh, icky matter, yuck, ugh. It decays, it dies, it gets plump around the middle, really gross. And so the Gnostics were like, we're the spiritual people, we're trying to get out of this evilly created world to some realm of pure spirit. And that attitude of kind of alienation to all that is around one, was very much the kind of environment that I lived in. But when Eliot spoke to me as being a very contemporary writer, I had to ask myself, how is it possible to be somebody utterly contemporary in your style, in your art, in your vision, and deeply and profoundly traditional as an upholder of this crazy Judeo-Christian, whatever you want to call it, tradition? And I know this may be like a duh issue for many of you, and maybe never was an issue, but for me at that point in time, in that cultural context, it was my epiphany, it was my Damascus Road, because I suddenly thought, cool, oh, that's how it works. Then I realized that's indeed what's always happened in the history of the West at any rate. Western culture thrives by change. Stylistic change comes about because one style starts becoming rote and is expected, and it calcifies and hardens, and it doesn't speak the way that it did when it first burst onto the scene. Something new comes around, new cultural circumstances, new challenges, and artists find a new language in which to deal with this. We tend to forget this. I mean, imagine, I always think what it would be like. Let's say you were like the greatest Romanesque architect in the world, and you were sitting there with your Romanesque architectural genius buddies, and you walk into that first Gothic cathedral, and you go, what do they think they are? All that light, all that verticality, none of the reassuring round arches of stability, all this pointy, this crazy, unstable, those guys are full of pride and arrogance. And I, came to realize, oh, well, that is actually how it happens. Styles change, they enable new languages to come out, and so that the thing itself, the thing being preserved, is preserved by that discovery of the new language, the new form. So I'm all excited. And I come back to my brethren and sisterin, and I say, guess what I figured out? And I said, then there's this Flannery O'Connor, get this. She uses violence and the grotesque. This is like before Tarantino. And, and I was like, that kicks some real ass. And isn't it cool, and it's slightly gross, but it's in your face, and it's weird, and it's mind-blowing. And, I would come back to my brethren and sister, and they would kind of all more or less go, meh. Let's read Dante. Well, I love Dante, but I kind of thought, wait, conservatives, hey, we're supposed to conserve something. Like, that means it has to still be alive? But essentially, the people around me thought something had died. It was dead. It was gone. It was preserved in museums and dusty marble bookended libraries. And so this was a real trauma for me, but I was trying to be a good conservative guy. Really, I was kind of being groomed in some ways, and willingly, to be kind of a culture warrior. I thought, okay, I'm literary, I'm just never going to be a political scientist or an economics guy. I was literary, so I thought that I would probably write like long, devastating book reviews, I would sort of write some book, review of some book by Philip Roth or Jonathan Franzen or something, and I would send them to bed with a migraine for 5 days. Yeah. Oh yeah. So all these things were coming together, and my first job out of college was, in fact, believe it or not, to work for William F. Buckley Jr. at National Review magazine, the classic journal of conservative thought. And this was in 1980, so imagine it. The summer and the fall of 1980, the years leading up to the election of Ronald Reagan. I mean, we were euphoric. I mean, this was the revolution. The revolution was being televised, and we were at the heart of it. I mean, Reagan was like willing to break all kinds of FCC rules and basically do advertisements for National Review on any stump he was at. So we were like feeling godlike. Except that I wasn't. I was struggling with all these conundrums, all these attitudes, this sort of political, ideological animus against the world that we lived in. It seemed so abstract. And it didn't help the fact that the minute that Reagan, was elected, I started, I was a junior guy, so I had to answer the phone all the time, and the phone just kept ringing off the hook saying, hey, have you heard about, are there any jobs in the Department of Education? And I'm like, isn't our editorial line that we should abolish the Department of Education? Oh no, but what's the difference between a G5 and a G6 salary range? Oh, anyway, so I was alienated, I was conflicted, and I wanted to get the hell out of Dodge. And I did. I went to grad school in England. And I pursued my hunches about art and literature and faith and the way that you preserve an ancient tradition. What I came to believe was summed up so beautifully by Yaroslav Pelikan, the great church historian, that tradition is the living faith of the dead. But traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And I was sick of the dead faith of the living, and I wanted the living faith of the dead. I wanted to find how that was. And so, at that point in my life, I had essentially, you can tell I'm a pretty sturdy guy, right? Somebody said, Greg, there are thoroughbreds and there are workhorses. You're a workhorse. And that's true. I'm big and hairy and loud. I come from New York City. I'm not exactly frail, but I had, for my life at that point in grad school, the equivalent of a kind of breakdown. Steam was coming out of my ears. This does not compute. I really was having a difficult time. And I realized that dream of being a critic, a deconstructor, an attacker, and a ginner was not for me. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. I didn't have the heart for it. And in fact, shockingly, what I really wanted to do was in fact the opposite. I wanted to build, I wanted to nurture, I wanted to educate, I wanted to bring people together. Crazy stuff, absolutely crazy stuff. And I really had no real sense of why all that was happening. So these insights basically came down to three fundamental realizations that I had. One was that culture is in some senses being neglected in an era of politicization. That politicization reduces everything to ideology and to abstraction, and that it sucks all the oxygen out of the air, that it thins out the cultural life by making it just a war of partisan against partisan. That in fact, politics, though a noble and necessary human enterprise, politics is shaped more powerfully by culture than politics is able to shape culture. That what we fight over in the political realm ultimately is shaped by the stories, the images, the symbols, the metaphors about what does health mean? What does choice mean? What does family mean? What does marriage mean? Well, the place where those meanings are made are in the concreteness of stories, narratives, novels, poems, paintings, dramas, etc. So that was one realization. The second realization was that styles change. Culture changes. Artistic styles reflect what's going on at the time. And that even if you are somewhat at odds with your time, you simply cannot act as if you are living in a time of Michelangelo or Shakespeare as much as you might like to. Then your work just becomes parody. You have to, even if you're fighting against the dominant idols of your time, you still have to take it into account in some ways. And Eliot did, and that's what I finally figured out about Eliot, was he would quote a fragment. For example, famously in his Ash Wednesday, he quotes this fragment from the famous Catholic hymn to Mary, the Salve Regina. After this our exile, he just puts that little fragment there. And of course, you read Eliot, he was kind of a depressive, melancholy guy, and you got this little fragment sitting on its own line, after this our exile. Oh, was this Eliot just being, grumpy and talking about, again, the modern world, we're exiled from paradise. Until you realize that the fragment, he wants us to look at the broken end of the fragment and think, what is the piece that fits where that fragment ends? What would be the whole? He's asking us, shocking, as readers, to do the work, to kind of put two and two together. And of course, as that hymn to Mary goes on, and after this our exile, show us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. That is what we've forgotten. That's what the fragment is hinting about, a kind of wholeness. So, culture more than politics. Styles change. Be aware of how artistic forms change in order to preserve ancient beliefs, traditions, traumas, conflicts. And then finally, this breakdown, this sense that I could no longer deconstruct, but that I had to construct. Into all this mix was my theological journey, and I'll make this mercifully short for you, but I was raised, it was kind of an odd upbringing theologically. When I was very young, we went to the Christian Science church, and then we shifted over to the Congregational church. So I didn't have an evangelical or Calvinist or Lutheran background to have to overcome. I'd call it more of an Emersonian kind of religiosity, a rather vague Emersonian religiosity. But nonetheless, it was not doing it for me. It was not doing it for me. It again felt too much in the head. I mean, God bless Christian Science. I don't want to say anything that's merely bigoted. I have great respect for it. Some of it still has rubbed itself off on me. But in some ways, Christian Science is a Gnostic abstraction. The flesh is, an illness are not real, and that if we only think properly, if we only use our noggin properly, everything will be okay. Well, I believe that there's a little thing called reality that the old noggin bumps into once in a while, and it has sharp edges and can't be just blown off. So I felt this was all very thin gruel. I wanted something more, but Catholicism was pretty out there for me. Growing up in a kind of waspy northeastern environment, I was really not very sure about it, but my reading ultimately converted me. I began to be fascinated by this group of novelists that I kept coming across. People kept saying, have you heard of Graham Greene? Have you heard of Evelyn Waugh? Georges Bernanos, Francois Mauriac, even Shusaku Endo, the Japanese Catholic novelist. I began to read these books. And in them I felt was a strength and a kind of strange paradoxical energy that really excited me. The key paradox that really still drives me today is Catholicism is this theological tradition that has a very high view of nature. We're not the types as Catholics to talk about, the total depravity of man. We have a higher view of human nature, of nature itself. Yes, it's been marred by sin, by the fall, but it's still possible to see much of God's intention and design and natural law within the world of nature. So the world of nature and grace in the Catholic world is deeply sacramental. It's the possibility of God's presence in the humblest of things is very much an attractive thing for me. I grew up in a very dualistic world. Now we're holy, now we're unholy. Now we do higher things, now we do lower things. And I was kind of living that sort of dualism in a way that really was part of the struggle that I was trying to find a way to live a more holistic experience. So on the one hand, Catholicism seems to say nature and grace, God and man, creator and creation are this beautiful, seamless continuity. On the other hand, a lot of what the Catholic Church seems to say would be, you could categorize using the biblical phrase, the sign of contradiction. Because this tradition that seemed to have such a wonderful sacramental positive view, at the same time seemed to have lots of weird stuff that just went totally against common sense, particularly in the moral realm. Catholic ideas about marriage, about divorce, about human life, about death, things that seem to go against what seems to be a vision of human flourishing. And I was really, struggling to see how a tradition that seemed to say grace and nature were so continuous, so interpenetrating, and then to say things that seemed to go so against common sense, normal human attitudes. But the paradox hooked me. The paradox hooked me. And I really came across this in a special way when I would read something like Evelyn Waugh, the great novelist. He's most famous for Brideshead Revisited. Some of his best books are actually much more wickedly satirical than that. But this was his big romantic story made into a couple different televised versions, televised version and then a film version. And you know the story, or you probably heard about it. It's about, these young people before World War II, and first the protagonist is in a deep relationship with a son of this aristocratic family, and then he gets into trouble and things go bad, and then this protagonist, Charles Ryder, falls in love with his sister, but she gets married to somebody else, and life goes on, and things go bad, and then he and this woman reunite and have an affair and decide that they're going to live happily ever after. But this is the Catholic family, so they have all these weird ideas. And it's not a spoiler to say that Catholicism plays this role of sign of contradiction in Brideshead Revisited, where something that seems natural and healthy, love, passion, these two people, they're right for each other, gets thwarted, it gets stopped by church teaching as this woman eventually returns to her faith and says, I can't marry you. I'm already married. I can't do it. My tutor at Oxford, by the way, was outraged by this. He thought, this demonstrating how inhuman Catholicism is. Something so good, so right, could be thwarted by this abstraction of Catholic doctrine. But in the novel, it's not abstract at all. Because in the novel, the whole novel is about what Augustine would call the ordering of our loves, and how difficult it is to order our loves and find that our love is appropriately looking for what it needs to find. And this protagonist, Charles Ryder, is very aesthetic. He's an artist. He's always looking in beauty, but he's looking for beauty without soul. And this is his Achilles heel. Anyway, so this novel comes out, and of course, Evelyn Waugh gets mail about it. Not all of it is fan mail. In fact, Waugh wrote famously in Time magazine, one of the famous letters that he got after writing Brideshead Revisited is, "Sir, I believe you intend to depict the Catholic Church in a positive light in this novel. However, it seems more like the kiss of death to me." And I think he would have loved that, because that very misconception, that very missing of the point, artists are really cruel people because they kind of tempt us to miss the point. Part of their genius is to say, what are our judgments? What are our snap judgments? And then tempt us to make a snap judgment and then try to undermine that and show us something deeper and more beautiful underneath that snap judgment that finally gets us to change our judgment. By the end of that novel, Charles Ryder, who's now in the Holocaust of World War II, has suddenly to pass by a little chapel where he sees a little flickering red candle, indicating the real presence of the sacrament there. And it says his step was lightened as he walked by. And that's as close as the book comes to affirming a change within him, that he's finally seen that what seemingly is inhuman has finally helped him to order his loves in a profound way. One thing I loved about Catholicism was that it didn't seem to be afraid of human desire. It did not treat desire as the enemy. That understood that desire, our love, is that which is driving us toward our destiny. And that the point is not to repress our desires or to be alienated from our desires or to simply label them as dark, dangerous things, but to say, what is their goal? What is their true end? So that to me was beautiful. The fact that the church was not alienated from the body was powerful to me. The fact in the long run that the church embraced suffering was important to me. My parents had divorced when I was in high school. I had grown up in a world where the very kindly minister came by and tried to ask us to look on the bright side. And God bless him, he had a terrible job. But he didn't have any theological language in which to talk about something that's broken, that's not going to get fixed this side of heaven. And that kind of fundamental dishonesty about the nature of reality is one of the Achilles heels of a lot of forms of Christianity in the world. But I sensed in these writers an embrace of suffering as itself a kind of sign of contradiction. Suffering as the kind of hollowing out of our hearts that makes a place for God to come in. It doesn't valorize suffering, it doesn't pretend that it's not horrible, but shows us that it is the pathway toward ordering our loves. I often think that the Americans have a particularly difficult time accepting tragedy. We say very blithely that Christianity is comic, right? Because comedy is circular. Creation, fall, redemption. Everything goes back to where it should be. And there's a deep truth to that. Dante's Divine Comedy is called a comedy, commedia, in that very sense. But there is also the cross. And that commedia, that circle, has a line, a linear line that's there, that goes athwart it. That's why the corpus on the cross, the crucifix, started to mean more to me than that empty cross, because I understood what suffering was, what loss was, and these novelists treated it so well. Graham Greene, in The Power and the Glory, showed me a world in which fallible, suffering, needy, desiring beings could nonetheless come to a place of mercy. At one point, the priest, who's known famously as the whiskey priest in this story, says, the narrator says, how often the priest had heard that same confession. Man was so limited, he hadn't even the ingenuity to invent a new vice. The animals knew as much. It was for this world that Christ had died. The more evil you saw and heard about you, the greater glory lay around the death. It was too easy to die for what was good or beautiful, for home or children or a civilization. It needed a God to die for the half-hearted and the corrupt. That capacity to look evil in the face, sinfulness in the face, neediness in the face, and not flinch, and not immediately separate things into little boxes of holiness and unholiness, was powerful to me. At one point, the priest is in a prison, and he's in here in the most degraded circumstances. It's disgusting. The smell of feces is in the air. There are people who are poor. This is during the communist persecution of Catholicism in Mexico in the 1920s. And there's a couple making love in the corner, and there's this pious woman who's going, gross. Can you make them stop? And this priest is sitting there, and she's saying, this is so ugly, this is so ugly. And he says, no. He says, there's beauty here, such a lot of beauty. Saints talk about the beauty of suffering. Well, we are not saints, you and I. Suffering to us is just ugly, stench and crowding and pain. That is beautiful in that corner, to them. It needs a lot of learning to see things with the saint's eye. A saint gets a subtle taste for beauty and can look down on poor ignorant palates like theirs. But we can't afford to. I know from experience how much beauty Satan carried down with him when he fell. Nobody ever said the fallen angels were the ugly ones. So for me, there was here a sacramental faith, a faith that was willing to be a sign of contradiction in defense of a deeper understanding of how to order our loves, and a faith that embraced the tragic sense without flinching and saw mercy and beauty even in our brokenness. So that was that. Now, last section. Thanks for being patient. It's getting a little warm in here. So, it all comes together when I tried to start this journal 25 years ago. I'm trying to imagine this new life that I have. I've been received into the church. I can walk around, can't I? Can you follow me? Okay, I'm suddenly in a walking mood. Maybe it'll help all of our drooping eyelids. So I think to myself, someone needs to carry this torch now. Someone needs to say, if Flannery O'Connor and Greene and Evelyn Waugh and all those guys who I admired, and I discovered others, by the way. I discovered the painter Georges Rouault. I discovered Stravinsky returned to his Christian faith and composed powerful works. I found that modernity and faith were not incompatible. I thought, this is 1989. I thought, who's going to do this now? And honestly, aside from Walker Percy, who was probably the most famous Catholic writer of the time, but he would be dead within a year, sadly, although I got to meet him at his Jefferson lecture, which is totally cool. This is an amazing guy. I told myself I was not going to go up and say, Dr. Percy, I'm your biggest fan, right? But he walked up the aisle and my body was just like, and I shook his hand, and he looked at me, and he talked to me for 5 minutes as if I was his oldest friend. We just had a great reunion. It was wonderful. I knew Walker Percy was there, but then I had this question of how to do what was going on in a time when I wasn't even sure if anyone was still doing it. Certainly the world that I had been immersed in said it wasn't possible. But a couple things happened. I went to a bookstore in Virginia. I found 2 volumes, a book by Paul Mariani, a poet who now teaches at Boston College, and a book by Andrew Hudgens, who teaches at Ohio State. His book was called Saints and Sinners. I forget which Mariani it was, maybe Crossing Casitas. Both of them were deeply honest about their struggles with faith that was part of their poetry, and their struggle with doubt. And I thought, well, if I can find 2 books in a bookstore at one time by 2 relatively obscure writers, maybe this is possible. I thought, man, maybe we'll end up at least putting out 3 or 4 issues. We'll make a footnote in some cultural history of the time. You know, this little journal valiantly tried to say it was still possible that art and faith could coexist in contemporary art. Haha, you know, RIP 1992. Well, we're about to send our 25th anniversary issue to the printer. And sometimes, you know, sometimes when you seek, you find. And I think one of the things that we've realized, as much as we'd like to say that we helped to bring a lot of change about within the church, within the culture, to say that that old myth was no longer true, I realize now that we were just kind of a bubble on a larger wave. I think in some ways the kind of high water mark of aggressive secularism was sort of the 70s and 80s. And when 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, everyone agreed that Karl Marx had a bad day that day. And Karl Marx, of course, is one of the great authors of the modern master narrative that challenged the Judeo-Christian master narrative. But you know what? Just as Karl Marx had a bad day, Sigmund Freud's been having some troubles too, particularly in his dismissal of religion as just escapism. And that kind of move deeper into postmodernism and post-whateverism has opened doorways. And there is now no longer the automatic scorn in the New York Times about a novel that embraces a struggle with faith in some way. So we looked and we found. Now, I'm almost out of time, but what I would say is the big discovery that I had to make was that the creative work that was being produced while I was producing this journal wasn't going to look the same as the very generation of writers and artists who converted me and gave me my vocation. And you might say that's a hard lesson to learn, because you fall hard. When you fall hard. And when you fall hard, you think that's the way. So, but then I caught myself and I thought, you know, if it's only the way Flannery O'Connor and Greene did it, that's the same locking into a single cultural stylistic language. That's imprisoning what's good into a particular time period and forgetting that it's not 1935 or 45 or 55 or 65 right now. What's changed? Well, you know, those writers wrote in the high modern period. They were in a period when those master narratives, secular master narratives, were really clashing publicly, boldly for the first time. That sort of thing emerged in the early 20th century. And they, as Christian writers, in some ways felt the need to fight back. And they were influenced by the artistic style of their time. Modernism used big gestures, right? You had Ezra Pound writing cantos and cantos and cantos and cantos so that the volume becomes this big. You had Joyce writing Ulysses. He writes this huge long novel, but he undergirds it with this classic ancient mythic structure. Now, modernists love that. And they love that bold gesture. And of course, when Flannery O'Connor famously said of her time, of her religiously illiterate time, she said of her own writing, for the hard of hearing you have to shout, and for the nearly blind you have to draw large and startling figures. She was both, in a sense, being a Christian fighting secularism, but at the same time she was very much a modernist writer. What has changed in the generations since then? Well, a lot. A lot has changed. For example, we've had a much greater suspicion of authority than they did in those days. You might reject the church back in those days, but you would respect it. And authority in general was not so suspect as it is now. We have many reasons to suspect authority, but not least of which is the fact that an authority has done some awful things. We've lost connection to the ancient traditions. We've lost continuity. We've walked away from the world that O'Connor and Waugh knew. We are very much interested in individual pathways. We are spiritual but not religious. So the writing and the art of the present that is going to try to connect with faith is probably going to be more tentative, more a matter of catching some faint echo of a still small voice, rather than boldly asserting through violence and the grotesque, or some vast, persecution of a priest by a communist regime, power and the glory, some much more domestic, quiet kinds of stories. And in fact, what I've tried to, in various things that I've written, tried to contrast would be to take a look at, put the power and the glory alongside a more contemporary novel that also tries to look at a saintly figure, at what holiness might mean. Because, of course, the whiskey priest in some ways ultimately is a martyr. And that's where a novel like Alice McDermott's Charming Billy is so instructive. Charming Billy is not about a priest being hounded through the Mexican jungle by communistic, atheist, lieutenant, evil guy. Billy is an Irish American growing up in the 40s in Queens, New York, ultimately working for Con Ed. Lower middle class guy, Irish guy. But here's the story. Billy, as a young man, meets a young woman from Ireland, of course, the home country, and falls in love with her. Flaming red hair, an idyllic moment. And they decide that they're going to get married. And she says she needs to go back to Ireland to, get organized and prepare the way. And he says, fine, she goes. And then weeks later, he's told that she's died. And of course, this isn't a plot spoiler. I know how terrible plot spoilers are. But she hasn't died at all. You kind of learn this within 20 pages of the beginning of the book. She's had cold feet. She's decided she doesn't want to do it. But the person who told Billy knew how in love with her. He decides through that lie to try to be merciful and to just kind of cut it off so that Billy no longer even thinks about it as a possibility. Well, obviously, Billy is devastated. He later goes on to become an alcoholic. And yet, Billy is one of those drunks who's always still charming. He's not an angry drunk. He's a sweet drunk, even if you have to collect him off the floor of the tavern at 3 a.m. and throw him in his bed. And he's always doing these amazing things. He's like writing little notes on cocktail napkins, popping in the mail, little love notes. I call them the epistles of St. Billy. They're beautiful. It's a beautiful little touch. And he's very quietly Catholic, but the novel barely kind of touches on it. There's one point where Billy kind of erupts later in life, and he erupts and he says, people say, the passion of our Lord was not so terrible because there was the resurrection. Well, it was terrible because death is terrible. And I will not embrace that kind of Pollyanna view. He went through it because it was terrible. This is kind of the tragic sense of life coming out again. And that's it. It's a very subtle book. Was he a saint? People could, Billy was a saint. Well, he's not a martyr to a communist regime, so maybe he wasn't a saint. It's easy to dismiss him as an alcoholic, but his faith, the alcoholism comes out of a woundedness, that woundedness of a faith in the beauty of love, the faith in this woman, the faith in Christ that he still maintains despite this suffering, despite this loss in his life. Now, I've been in a debate, some of you may have heard, with some contemporary Catholic writers like Dana Joy and Paul Elie. Paul Elie in particular has dismissed this book as not being a very deeply Christian or Catholic novel because it's looking back to the past, which normally I would say, you've heard me already make that argument, right? Let's not look back to the past, let's look to the present. But what Elie misses about this novel is that it's told by a narrator. And the narrator is somebody who very much lives in the present. She's the next generation down. She's left Queens for good. She now lives in Seattle, which is about as far from Queens as you can get. It's the modern world of postmodern technology and freedom from religion and institutions as you can get. But she tells the story. And if you look carefully, if you read carefully, the way that she begins to change, the fact that she's even telling the story about Billy, why is she so fascinated by him? We see her change from anger at the church to a sense of her own generation's inadequacies. At one point she says, of her own generation, self-sacrifice having been recognized as a delusion by then. And then she adds this little kicker, if I can find my place. Not a virtue. Self-consciousness more the vogue. Self-consciousness more the vogue. That's her speaking of her generation. By the end of the story, after telling Billy's story, she speaks at the very end of my father's faith and Billy's and some part of my own. That's that tentative, whispering faith. It's no longer a shout. Now, again, I'm over my time. Are shouts and whispers the only two ways to speak about faith in the dramatic form of art and literature? No. There's probably, every good analogy breaks down. There may be squeaks of faith, honks of faith, I don't know. I really don't want to push this metaphor too far. Do I believe through this career of mine that, as some of these people I've been debating, that we don't have contemporary writers who equal that other generation? No, I don't. I really believe that we have writers today who are every bit the equal of those earlier generation. If you want to do it in Q&A, I can try to tell you why I think Cormac McCarthy is the greatest living Catholic writer. Profoundly Catholic vision, even though a lot of people suspect McCarthy of a kind of nihilism. But that's the artist tricking you. He's trying to trick you into thinking that in order to see if you might figure out why that's not true. So I hope to be going at this for, if not 25 more years, a few more. And let me close with a poem. I started by talking about Newman and Heart Speaks to Heart and the importance of the way that the imagination helps us to move away from abstraction and ideology towards reality and towards real communion and connection. And I thought of this poem by the great Scott Cairns, poet at University of Missouri, who's done a series of poems, very playful, funny poems if you're into his kind of humor, called Adventures in New Testament Greek. And this poem is called Adventures in New Testament Greek, nous, which is the Greek word for reason. So here's Adventures in New Testament Greek, nous, by Scott Cairns. You could almost think the word synonymous with mind, given our so far narrow history, and the excessive esteem in which we have been led to hold what is, in this case, our rightly designated nervous system. Little wonder then that some presume the mind itself both part and parcel of the person, the very seat of soul, and lately crucible for a host of chemical incentives, of which can pretty much answer for most of our habits and for our affections. When even the handy lexicon cannot quite place the nous as anything beyond one rustic ancestor of reason, you might be satisfied to trouble the old term no further, and so would fail to find your way to it. Most fruitful faculty, untried, dormant in its roaring cave, the heart's intellective aptitude grows dim, unless you find a way to waken it. So, let's try something, even now. And we can try this too. Let's try something, even now. Even as you tend these lines, attend for a moment to your breath as you draw it in. Regard the breath's cool descent, a stream from mouth to throat to the furnace of the heart. Observe that queer, cool confluence of breath and blood, and do your thinking there. Thank you very much.
Besides Alice McDermott and Cormac McCarthy, I wonder what other contemporary writers of whatever faith do you think they're dramatizing well the struggle with faith in the contemporary world?
Well, again, debatably, but I would put a vote in favor Marilynne Robinson. I mean, Pulitzer Prize winning author of Gilead. Now again, Paul Elie dismisses her because she's writing about the mid-1950s. But even the fact that some of these writers today are writing about an older generation speaks to the nature of our time. It is in some ways, every generation has to question its ancestors. It's the children questioning the parents. Where did you get this from? This thing that you seem to hold so naturally, that doesn't come naturally to me. So I'm not as put out as Paul Elie is by some of these books that are set in the past, but I think the depiction of John Ames, the preacher there, and the very subtle indictment of the church and of America for racism that runs throughout those books. The Home is the second. The third volume in what really is a trilogy called Lila will be coming out later this year. She's Calvinist. She is every bit as brilliant a Calvinist as O'Connor was a Thomist. But there are many other writers that are out there. I mean, I've put lists out. I think Oscar Huelos's Mr. Ives' Christmas is another book about a saint. So in some ways, it's kind of fun to read The Power and the Glory, Charming Billy, and Mr. Ives' Christmas. Another book about a saint I'm really excited about is by a very young author, at least emerging author, named Christopher Beha, I don't know how to pronounce his name, B-E-H-A, called What Happened to Sophie Wilder. It was published by Tin House, which is a literary magazine, a secular publisher. What happened to Sophie Wilder, well, that's a term that takes on all kinds of different meanings when you read the book. But this is a young, vivacious writer, published her first book, marriage goes bad, reads The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton, and to the shock of everyone around her becomes Catholic. And this book has been praised as having one of the most powerfully convincing conversion scenes, and that's one of the hardest things to depict. And how to get inside a conversion experience, devilishly difficult. But Mary Karr is a poet, Franz Wright. There are still people like Mary Gordon around who sometimes slip our mind, who are deeply, profoundly Catholic in their sensibilities. There are many beyond the Catholic fold. Sir Geoffrey Hill, currently professor of poetry at Oxford, at least by some standards, the greatest living poet in English. I mean, it's debatable, of course, but he has that kind of gravitas, even the prophetic dimension that you would use in the same terms for T.S. Eliot, for example. In contemporary music, you have composers like Arvo Pärt, the late Henryk Goretzky, people who are going back to medieval chant and Renaissance polyphony, but blending it with minimalism in ways that are seeking mystery in the sacred. Their albums are flying off the shelves. Annie Dillard, I mean, the list is long. It's part of the debate, I think, is, as I said earlier, I think, and it's natural, and it's really probably wise. Every generation's set of writers we hold on a kind of probationary status. They're close to us. It's very hard to know, will that writer enter the canon or not? With McCarthy and Robinson, I'm thinking, yeah, probably, pretty much. Pärt in music, Hill in poetry. But then there are these others. Are they flash in the pan? That's where we can have real aesthetic differences. But when Dana Gioia put a listing of all the great writers in the mid-20th century, I think he was scraping the bottom of the barrel to put Jack Kerouac and Ernest Hemingway under the list of Catholic writers. I thought my list kicked his butt, my list of contemporary writers for sheer depth of engagement with faith. But
so a quick follow-up, where do we find your list?
Well, it's I've responded to Dana's First Things piece on First Things. We actually put together, all these debates have been happening like half a dozen different websites. So actually at Image's blog a week or so ago, we put just one post was just all the links. Paul Eli's New York Times piece, my Wall Street Journal response, Dana's First Things piece, my online First Things response. And Paul and I have been sort of duking it out a little bit since then.
So it's on the images website.
It is. If anyone wants to, gwolf@spu.edu. Friend me on Facebook, by the way. I love you. I'd be happy to get you that information. But it's so odd these days when you're doing this over blogs that you're kind of chasing these links across the internet.
I have a question. You mainly spoke about English and British literature, and you mentioned Shusaku Endo, of course. And one of the things that has come up, just in my own studies, and really with my grad students, is Catholicism, or at least this Catholic discourse aesthetic, as a global, you use the term maybe transnational, that's a little bit more sexy now, our globalization theory comes up. And so are you familiar with somebody in Africa or in the Caribbean or South America that you would hold up as a kind of another person who is dealing with those same kinds of postmodern yet deeply rich Catholic tradition?
From Nigeria, a writer named Akpan, A-K-P-A-N, who happens to be a Jesuit. Who knew? He wrote a book of short stories called Say You're One of Them. Oprah picked it. I mean, again, mainstream publisher, heartbreaking book. It's stories kind of scattered from the whole African subcontinent, and a lot of the stories are deeply painful, but again, a deeply Catholic sensibility, as you might imagine, and his own issues that are not the same as Western issues. There's a Swedish Catholic convert, Torgny Lindgren, really crazy stuff. He wrote this novel about King David that was like way out of line. It was, and totally cool. Very naughty book, but serious, not ironic. The recent Nobelist, Thomas Transtromer, he's not Catholic. I think he's Lutheran, if anything. But Transtromer's poetry contains deep, sincere grappling with issues of faith and doubt. Wee Tan, Singaporean writer, very young still, probably barely into her 40s now. She wrote a book called Foreign Bodies, about being young and global and going from Singapore to Oxford and New York. And so there are, in fact, transnational writers, and their work is enriching and demonstrating the whole Catholicity principle.
Any other question?
I can talk about. I was wondering, so I read Dana Joy's thing in First Things, and one of his sort of arguments maybe wasn't just that there's a narrative decline in Catholic arts, but that the Catholic church and culture isn't doing enough to sort of support the artists that are there. So I was wondering if you thought that that was a fair statement, like if it, I was mid-century Catholicism better at saying, here are our great artists, Catholics should read them, and that's less true today, or is that sort of a false line of thought?
The footnote to that would be that I think the mid-century Catholic embrace of those artists and writers was less fulsome than he thinks it was. I mean, you had people like Graham Greene getting addressed by the Vatican, what the equivalent of the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. You had Evelyn Waugh, who was making fun of Western colonialism in Africa by using the satirical device in his novel Black Mischief of a pageant of contraception in which the Westerners were coming in and they were trying, anyway, long story short. And he had to answer to the Archbishop of Westminster. Anyway, so there's a little, face it, writers are neurotic loners who are desperate for company. And the notion of some wonderfully clubbable group of people in the old days has been a little bit romanticized. Dana and I do agree that there's kind of a bottleneck right now. And the bottleneck in some ways is both the hierarchy, although he's given up on them, and so have I, sorry. But even more importantly, kind of Catholic intellectual discourse. I mean, I've written for Commonweal, I've written for First Things. They're probably going to never ask me again, but they get F minus. Because again, politics is everything. Politics drives everything, and the cultural, this need, and it's not just literature and the arts, we Catholics are living in a thinner and thinner culture. It's not just that we don't appreciate the arts, it's that we're not living a thick cultural Catholicism anymore. It's reduced to ideas and manifestos and stands. But there's this bottleneck through the Catholic intellectual culture, and I think Catholic study centers and intellectual centers are beginning to take up some of the slack. I've been working with the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at USC, Father Jim Heft, who's amazing. There are really vibrant Catholic studies centers at the University of St. Thomas and elsewhere that are beginning to do this. There are blogs. Jesuit Post has been doing a wonderful series of interviews with some of these literary guys like Dana and me and Nick Rapatrizone and so on. So we've got to try to sort of smash that bottleneck and open up the conversation and not make politics trump everything else.
Well, thank you very much. This was really an extraordinary time with us today. We really appreciate it. Gregory Wolfe, everybody. Please give him a round of applause.